Once upon a time, in the bustling heart of a modern city, a young black man named Jamal was living a life full of dreams and determination. Jamal had worked hard to make something of himself, striving every day to turn the challenges of his life into stepping stones for success. He had built a career as a chauffeur, a job he took immense pride in because it allowed him to meet people from all walks of life while exploring the city he loved. But one day, an incident occurred that would challenge his patience and spark a series of events that no one could have predicted. Jamal's day started like any other. Dressed sharply in his crisp uniform, he arrived early at the office, checking over the sleek black limousine he had been assigned to drive that day. The limo was immaculate, gleaming in the sunlight like a symbol of luxury and class. He loved the sense of importance that came with his job and the joy of providing his clients with a comfortable, first-class experience. That morning, Jamal received a booking for a high-profile pickup. A group of business executives had scheduled a ride from a prestigious hotel to an upscale corporate event downtown. He reviewed the details, confirmed the route, and drove to the hotel, his professionalism evident in every move he made. As Jamal parked outside the grand entrance, he noticed the group of passengers waiting on the curb. They were well-dressed, clearly accustomed to a life of privilege and convenience. He stepped out of the limo, straightened his tie, and opened the door for them with a polite smile. But what happened next caught him completely off guard. One of the executives, a middle-aged man with an air of superiority, glanced at Jamal and frowned. "Is this our driver?" he asked, loud enough for everyone around to hear. The tone in his voice wasn't just skeptical, it was dismissive. Another passenger, a woman in an elegant suit, exchanged a look with the man and whispered something under her breath. Jamal caught fragments of their conversation, enough to understand their discomfort. The group hesitated, and then the man stepped forward, crossing his arms. "We were expecting someone different," he said, his words dripping with implication. Jamal stood there, his heart sinking but his composure intact. He had faced prejudice before, but it never got easier. He could feel the judgment in their eyes, the unspoken assumption that his skin color somehow made him less capable. Despite the sting of their words, Jamal remained calm, his professional demeanor unwavering. "The car is ready for you, sir," he said, his voice steady. The man shook his head. "No offense," he began, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but we'd prefer a different driver." The group murmured in agreement, their discomfort palpable. They turned their backs, signaling to the hotel concierge to request a replacement. Jamal clenched his fists momentarily, the rejection cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. But instead of arguing or letting anger take over, he simply nodded and stepped aside. "Of course, sir. I'll ensure you're accommodated," he said politely, though his mind was racing with frustration and hurt. As Jamal walked back to the limo, he couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. He had worked tirelessly to build a reputation for excellence in his job, yet here he was, being dismissed not for his skills or service but for something entirely out of his control. He sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as a mixture of emotions swirled inside him. But Jamal wasn't one to dwell on negativity for long. He believed in rising above challenges and proving people wrong through actions, not words. That's when an idea struck him, a way to turn the situation around in a manner they would never expect. Instead of driving away, Jamal made a call to his manager, explaining what had just happened. He requested permission to handle the situation in his own way, and after a brief conversation, he had the green light. With a renewed sense of determination, he set a plan in motion that would leave everyone involved stunned. Minutes later, Jamal returned to the hotel, but this time, he wasn't driving the same car. He pulled up in the most extravagant vehicle the company owned, a pristine stretch limousine that seemed to go on for miles. Its glossy black exterior reflected the sunlight like a mirror, and the moment it rolled to a stop, heads turned. Jamal stepped out once again, his posture confident and his smile unshakable. The group of executives, still waiting for their replacement ride, couldn't hide their surprise. Their jaws dropped as they realized that the man they had dismissed so easily was now standing in front of the most luxurious car they had ever seen. The air grew thick with tension as Jamal walked toward them, his every step a silent statement. But what happened next would truly shift the course of the day, leaving everyone present questioning their assumptions and grappling with a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. And that's where this incredible story begins. Stay tuned to see how Jamal's bold move not only changed perceptions but also proved that dignity, determination, and professionalism could triumph over prejudice in the most unexpected way. The silence outside the hotel was almost deafening as Jamal approached the group of executives. They were still staring at the limousine, their disbelief plastered on their faces. It was a car straight out of their dreams, the kind reserved for the elite of the elite. For a moment, none of them could speak. Jamal finally broke the silence, his voice calm and composed but with a subtle edge of confidence that hadn't been there before. "Good afternoon again," he said, maintaining the same polite tone he had used earlier. "I thought I'd bring a vehicle more suited to your expectations." The man who had initially dismissed Jamal blinked in surprise. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. The woman beside him, who had been quick to agree with him earlier, fidgeted uncomfortably, avoiding Jamal's gaze. Jamal held the limo door open, gesturing toward the plush leather seats inside. "Shall we?" he asked, as if nothing had happened. His professionalism was impeccable, but there was a quiet strength in his demeanor, a silent assertion that he was in control of the situation now. The group hesitated, their earlier confidence now replaced by awkwardness. They exchanged glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The man coughed and stepped forward, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "Well, this is unexpected," he said, his tone noticeably softer. "We didn't realize what, sir?" Jamal asked, tilting his head slightly. His question was polite, but the underlying message was clear: he wasn't going to let them off the hook easily. The man faltered, his face reddening slightly. Nothing. Let's just get going," he muttered, brushing past Jamal and climbing into the limo. The others followed, their earlier arrogance now replaced with an uneasy silence. As Jamal closed the door behind them, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. But his job wasn't done yet. He climbed into the driver's seat, adjusted the rearview mirror, and set off toward their destination. Inside the limo, the atmosphere was tense. The passengers seemed to avoid looking at one another, their earlier camaraderie replaced by a heavy sense of guilt and discomfort. Jamal could hear snippets of their whispered conversations, their voices tinged with embarrassment. "He really showed us up, didn't he?" one of them murmured. "Well, what did you expect?" "We were out of line," another replied. Jamal focused on the road, his face neutral, but inside, he felt a sense of vindication. He hadn't lashed out or let their prejudice get the better of him. Instead, he had let his actions speak for themselves, and the impact was undeniable. As they approached their destination, Jamal decided to take the opportunity to address the elephant in the room, not with anger, but with grace. He activated the intercom system, his voice filling the luxurious cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I hope you're enjoying the ride. I wanted to take a moment to thank you for giving me the opportunity to serve you today. It's not every day I get to showcase the best vehicle in our fleet, and I'm glad I could make this experience special for you." His words were kind, almost disarming, but there was an unmistakable weight to them. The passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly aware of the deeper meaning behind his statement. When they arrived at the venue, Jamal once again stepped out to open the door for them. This time, the group exited the car with a noticeable change in their demeanor. The man who had initially dismissed him paused, looking Jamal in the eye. "Thank you." "Jamal, was it?" he said, his voice hesitant but genuine. "Yes, sir," Jamal replied, his tone steady. The man nodded, his expression softening. "You're very good at what you do. I apologize for earlier. I misjudged you." Jamal smiled, his response as dignified as ever. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that." As the group walked away, Jamal felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond the job itself. He had taken a moment of prejudice and turned it into an opportunity for growth, not just for himself, but for those who had underestimated him. But little did Jamal know, this was just the beginning. What happened next would ripple far beyond that day, bringing unexpected recognition and opportunities that would change his life forever. As Jamal drove away from the venue, he couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just happened. It wasn't every day that someone like him, often judged by appearances, could turn a moment of prejudice into a lesson without uttering a single angry word. His calm demeanor and professionalism had left an impression, one that seemed to resonate far beyond the confines of that limousine. Later that evening, as Jamal returned the limo to the company's garage, he was greeted by his manager, Mr. Collins, a kind-hearted man who had always believed in Jamal's potential. "Jamal," Mr. Collins began, walking toward him with a curious expression, "I just got a call from the hotel concierge. Apparently, the executives you drove today had a lot to say about you." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Oh? What did they say?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Mr. Collins smiled. "They said you were the epitome of professionalism and class. One of them even mentioned how you handled a misunderstanding with grace. They were so impressed, they requested you specifically for their next booking." Jamal couldn't help but chuckle. "Is that so? Well, I'm glad they appreciated the service." But Mr. Collins wasn't finished. "That's not all," he said, leaning in conspiratorially. "Apparently, one of them is a prominent figure in the corporate world, and he's been telling everyone about you. Word is spreading fast, Jamal. You might just become the most sought-after driver in the city." Jamal was taken aback. He hadn't expected his actions to spark such a reaction. He had simply done what he believed was right, refusing to let prejudice define him or his work. Over the next few weeks, the impact of that day became more apparent. The limousine company began receiving an influx of requests for Jamal's services. Clients were intrigued by the story of the calm and confident driver who had turned an uncomfortable situation into a lesson in dignity. One day, Jamal received an unexpected call. On the other end of the line was a reporter from a popular lifestyle magazine. "Mr. Jamal," the reporter began, "your story has been making waves. We'd love to feature you in an article about overcoming bias and redefining professionalism. Would you be open to an interview?" Jamal hesitated for a moment, unsure of how he felt about being thrust into the spotlight. But then he thought about the importance of the message, how many others might benefit from hearing his story. "Sure," he said, his voice steady. "I'd be happy to share my experience." The article, titled "Driving Change: How One Man Turned Prejudice into an Opportunity for Growth," became an overnight sensation. Readers were captivated by Jamal's story, and it sparked conversations about bias, dignity, and the power of leading by example. As more opportunities came his way, Jamal found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about his family, his community, and the countless others who faced similar challenges every day. He realized that his story wasn't just about him, it was about breaking down barriers and inspiring others to rise above adversity. One day, Jamal received an invitation to speak at a corporate diversity and inclusion event. Standing before an audience of business leaders, he shared his story with honesty and humility. "We all have the power to change perceptions," he said, his voice resonating with conviction. "Sometimes, it's not about what we say but what we do. Actions speak louder than words, and dignity is a language everyone understands." The crowd erupted into applause, and Jamal knew in that moment that his message had reached them. But the story didn't end there. Jamal's newfound platform allowed him to advocate for greater representation and opportunities for people from all backgrounds. He launched a mentorship program for young professionals, sharing his experiences and guiding them to navigate the challenges of the working world with confidence and resilience. Years later, Jamal would look back on that fateful day outside the hotel as a turning point, not just for his career, but for his life. He had faced prejudice head-on and emerged stronger, proving that kindness and professionalism could disarm even the most deeply rooted biases. And as he continued to drive forward, both literally and metaphorically, Jamal carried with him the knowledge that sometimes, the most profound changes start with a single, determined step in the right direction. Jamal's hands gripped the steering wheel as he drove back to the garage, his mind swirling with thoughts about what had just unfolded. The day had started like any other, a routine pickup, another group of clients to chauffeur around the city. He'd done this job long enough to know what to expect. Small talk, quiet drives, and the occasional comment about the weather. But nothing could have prepared him for the cold sting of rejection when the man in the expensive suit had refused to ride with him. He replayed the moment in his head, not out of anger but out of curiosity. Why had they judged him so quickly? Was it his skin color, his appearance, or something else entirely? He had heard stories like this before, but living it firsthand was a different matter. Still, Jamal wasn't the type to dwell on negativity. His mother had raised him to hold his head high, no matter what. "Don't let them take away your pride, Jamal," she used to say. "What you carry inside you is worth more than anything they'll ever see on the outside." Her words echoed in his mind as he arrived at the garage. Parking the limo carefully, Jamal stepped out and ran a hand over the sleek, polished exterior. It was the kind of car that turned heads, luxurious, elegant, and intimidating all at once. He had been proud to drive it, but today, it had become more than just a car. It had become a symbol of something larger, something he couldn't quite put into words yet. As he locked up for the night, Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a text from his best friend, Marcus. "Marcus *, how's it going, man? You good?" Jamal smiled faintly, grateful for Marcus's knack for checking in at just the right moments. Jamal *, long day. You won't believe what happened. The two exchanged messages as Jamal walked home, his steps steady but his mind still restless. By the time he reached his small but cozy apartment, he felt a little lighter. Talking to Marcus always had a way of grounding him. Later that evening, as Jamal sat down to his dinner, his thoughts drifted to the people he'd driven earlier. Who were they, really? Their expensive clothes and confident attitudes suggested they were important, maybe business executives, maybe something else. But their reaction to him had revealed a different side, one that spoke of prejudice and ignorance. Jamal didn't hate them. In fact, he felt a strange mix of pity and curiosity. What had shaped their attitudes? What made them see someone like him as less than worthy? He didn't have answers, but he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't let their biases define him. The next morning, Jamal's routine started as usual. He arrived at the garage early, checked the schedule, and prepared his assigned vehicle for the day. But as he went about his tasks, he noticed whispers among his co-workers. "Did you hear about Jamal's ride yesterday?" one of them said, not realizing Jamal was within earshot. "Yeah, apparently it got intense. But you know Jamal, cool as a cucumber." Jamal chose not to interrupt, but the murmurs followed him throughout the day. By the time he returned from his first trip, he found Mr. Collins waiting for him, a curious smile on his face. "You're becoming quite the topic of conversation around here," Mr. Collins said, leaning against the doorframe of the office. Jamal raised an eyebrow. "I didn't realize I was so interesting." Collins chuckled. "Oh, you'd be surprised. Word gets around fast, especially when it's a story like yours." Jamal frowned slightly. "What story?" "The one about you handling those executives yesterday. People are talking, Jamal. They're impressed." Jamal wasn't sure how to feel about this newfound attention. On one hand, it was nice to be recognized for maintaining his professionalism under pressure. On the other hand, he didn't want to be defined by a single moment. "Thanks, Mr. Collins," Jamal said, keeping his tone measured. "I just did my job." Collins nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes, doing your job is the most powerful thing you can do." As the day went on, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There was a weight to the events of the previous day, a sense that they were leading to something bigger. He didn't know what that something was yet, but he could feel it lurking just beneath the surface. Later that week, Jamal received a surprising phone call. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, yet it carried an air of authority. "Is this Jamal?" the caller asked. "Yes, this is he," Jamal replied cautiously. "My name is Mr. Reynolds. I was one of the passengers in the limo earlier this week. I wanted to reach out to you personally." Jamal's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "How can I help you, sir?" There was a pause, and when Mr. Reynolds spoke again, his tone was noticeably softer. I owe you an apology. We didn't treat you with the respect you deserve, and for that, I'm truly sorry. Jamal wasn't sure how to respond. The apology was unexpected, but it felt sincere. Thank you, sir, he said after a moment. I appreciate that. But that's not the only reason I'm calling, Mr. Reynolds continued. I was impressed by how you handled the situation, your composure, your professionalism. It's rare to meet someone like you, and I'd like to discuss an opportunity. Jamal's curiosity was piqued, but he remained cautious. What kind of opportunity? I'd prefer to discuss it in person, Reynolds said. If you're available, I'd like to meet with you next week. My assistant will coordinate the details. Jamal agreed, though he couldn't help but wonder what this meeting was about. As he hung up the phone, a mix of excitement and apprehension coursed through him. The following days passed in a blur as Jamal continued his usual routine, but the upcoming meeting weighed heavily on his mind. Who was Mr. Reynolds, really? And what kind of opportunity could he possibly have in mind? When the day of the meeting arrived, Jamal dressed carefully, choosing a sharp suit that exuded confidence and professionalism. He arrived at the appointed location, a sleek, modern office building downtown, and was greeted by a poised receptionist who led him to a conference room. As he waited, Jamal took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had faced tougher situations than this. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready. The door opened, and Mr. Reynolds walked in, his demeanor much different from the man Jamal had met in the hotel driveway. This version of Reynolds seemed thoughtful, even humble, as he extended a hand. Jamal, he said warmly. Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat. Jamal sat down, his eyes meeting Reynolds's with quiet confidence. Whatever was about to unfold, he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer the man who had been dismissed so easily. This time, he was in control. And as the conversation began, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Mr. Reynolds settled into the chair across from Jamal, his demeanor relaxed but with an unmistakable air of purpose. For a moment, he studied Jamal, as though trying to figure out how best to begin. Jamal returned his gaze calmly, waiting for whatever was to come. I want to start by saying something I should have said in the moment, Mr. Reynolds began. I misjudged you, and that's entirely on me. I pride myself on being someone who sees beyond appearances, but that day, I failed. Jamal nodded slowly, appreciating the man's willingness to acknowledge his mistake but not yet sure where this conversation was heading. It's not every day someone comes into your life and teaches you a lesson without saying a word, Reynolds continued. Your professionalism, your grace under pressure, it caught me off guard. It made me realize there's a lot I need to reevaluate about myself. Jamal leaned back slightly, letting the words sink in. He could sense the sincerity in Reynolds's tone, but he was still unsure why he had been called here. Thank you, sir, Jamal replied. I'm glad my actions made an impression, but I was just doing my job. That's exactly it, Reynolds said, leaning forward. You did your job, but you did it with dignity and pride, even when faced with blatant disrespect. That kind of character is rare, Jamal, and it's something I deeply admire. Jamal remained silent, allowing Reynolds to continue. I run a transportation company, Reynolds explained. It's smaller than the one you work for now, but we're growing steadily. What sets us apart is our focus on service, high-end, personalized experiences for clients who value professionalism above all else. Jamal raised an eyebrow, starting to see where this was going. I want you to join my team, Reynolds said. Not just as a driver, but as someone who can help shape the culture of our company. We need people like you, people who can lead by example. The offer caught Jamal off guard. He had expected some kind of apology, maybe a gesture of goodwill, but this was something else entirely. That's an interesting proposition, Jamal said carefully. But why me? You barely know me. Reynolds smiled. I know enough. I know that in the face of disrespect, you chose integrity. I know that you value your work and carry yourself with pride. Those qualities are worth more to me than any resume. Jamal took a moment to process the offer. The idea of working for a company where he could make a real impact was appealing, but he needed time to think it through. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," Jamal said finally. "I'm honored by your offer, but I'll need some time to consider it." "Of course," Reynolds replied. "Take all the time you need. In the meantime, I'll have my assistant send you more details about the position. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out." As Jamal left the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was at a crossroads. The opportunity Reynolds had presented was tempting, but it also came with risks. Could he trust this man who had once dismissed him so easily? And was he ready to leave the comfort of his current job for something entirely new? Over the next few days, Jamal found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him to this point. He thought about the long hours he had spent behind the wheel, the countless faces he had encountered, and the lessons he had learned along the way. He also thought about the man who had refused to ride with him, and the unexpected twist that had followed. Life had a funny way of throwing curveballs, and this one had left Jamal questioning everything he thought he knew. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, Jamal called Marcus to share the news. "Man, you've got some big decisions to make," Marcus said after hearing the story. "But you know what? This sounds like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You'd be crazy not to at least give it a shot." Jamal chuckled. "You think so?" "Absolutely," Marcus replied. "Look, you've got the talent and the drive. You've always been about more than just getting from point A to point B. This is your chance to show the world what you're really made of." Encouraged by Marcus's words, Jamal decided to dig deeper into Reynolds' company. He spent hours researching online, reading reviews, and even reaching out to a few current employees. What he found surprised him. The company had a solid reputation for excellence, and Reynolds himself was known for his hands-on approach and commitment to his team. It seemed like the kind of place where Jamal could thrive, but he still had lingering doubts. As the days turned into weeks, Jamal found himself weighing the pros and cons. On one hand, he valued the stability and familiarity of his current job. On the other hand, the prospect of joining Reynolds' company felt like a step towards something bigger, something that could truly challenge and inspire him. One evening, after much deliberation, Jamal made his decision. He picked up the phone and dialed Reynolds' number, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mr. Reynolds," Jamal said when the man answered. "I've thought it over, and I'm ready to take the leap." Reynolds' voice was warm with excitement. "That's wonderful news, Jamal. Welcome to the team." As Jamal hung up the phone, he felt a sense of both excitement and apprehension. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: he was ready to embrace the journey, wherever it might lead. And so, with a mix of hope and determination, Jamal prepared to take the first step toward a new chapter in his life, a chapter defined not by the prejudices of others, but by his own unwavering belief in himself. Jamal's decision to join Reynolds' company wasn't an easy one, but as he arrived for his first day, a new kind of tension settled in his chest. The sleek black limo he'd driven to the office was a stark contrast to the familiar yellow cab he had once spent countless hours in, its leather seats and polished wood feeling worlds away from his former ride. He sat in the back, trying to calm his nerves. This was it. The opportunity he had been offered was no longer just an idea, it was real. But with it came a new world of uncertainty. As the limo glided through the city streets, Jamal thought about the weight of his decision. He knew this wasn't just about moving to a new job, it was about breaking away from everything he had known. He had spent years working with a team of drivers who respected him, but that respect was limited by the boundaries of their roles. In Reynolds' company, however, there were no such limits. The stakes were higher, and Jamal's presence would be felt in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The building loomed ahead, a tall, modern structure that screamed luxury. As Jamal stepped out of the car, he couldn't help but feel a sense of intimidation. He was no longer just one of many drivers, now, he was part of something bigger. Something that could change everything for him. The receptionist greeted him with a smile, handing him a visitor badge, and directed him toward the elevator. As the doors closed, Jamal's heart began to race. Was he truly ready for this? Could he live up to the expectations Reynolds had for him? The floor he was led to was as pristine and polished as the exterior of the building itself. There were sleek glass windows, towering plants, and expensive art on the walls. It felt like a different universe from the world Jamal had grown accustomed to. As he walked through the halls, he caught snippets of conversations, talks about upcoming events, VIP clients, and special arrangements that made his job at the other company seem mundane. He had been given a chance, but with it came a pressure to prove that he belonged. In the back of his mind, Jamal couldn't stop thinking about the incident that had set everything in motion. The white customers who had refused to ride with him had triggered something deep inside him, but he couldn't fully explain it. There was a fire that had sparked that day, something that pushed him to make a choice, to take a stand. But now that he was here, in this new world, he wondered if he was out of his depth. Was he simply a pawn in Reynolds' game? Or was this truly the chance he had been waiting for? Jamal's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He looked up to find a young woman with a clipboard, her expression professional but warm. She introduced herself as Claire, and with a few quick words, she led him into Reynolds' office. "Good to see you, Jamal," Reynolds said, standing up to greet him with a firm handshake. His smile was genuine, but there was something about the way he held himself that made Jamal feel like he was being sized up. "Come in, have a seat." Jamal sat across from him, trying to shake the unease that lingered in his stomach. Reynolds was a man of action, a man who didn't waste time with small talk. He got straight to the point. "I'm glad you've decided to join us," Reynolds began, leaning back in his chair. "But let me be clear, Jamal. This company is about more than just driving. We're about creating experiences. Every client, every ride, every detail, it matters. We demand the best, and that's what you'll be expected to deliver." Jamal nodded, absorbing the gravity of the words. He had heard this kind of talk before, but somehow, it felt different now. "I understand," Jamal replied. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes." Reynolds smiled, clearly pleased. But before he could continue, Claire entered the room with a folder. She handed it to Reynolds, who flipped through the papers quickly. "Jamal," Reynolds said, his tone turning more serious. "I need you to be aware of something. There's more to this business than just the clients. There are other drivers here, all competing for the top spots. There's a hierarchy, and if you want to rise, you'll need to prove yourself." Jamal's brow furrowed. He hadn't expected this. The idea of competition among the drivers was something he hadn't considered. "I'm not concerned about competing," Jamal said, his voice steady. "I'm here to work hard and give my best. That's all." Reynolds nodded approvingly but didn't say much more. Instead, he handed Jamal a list of protocols and guidelines for the company. "Familiarize yourself with these. They're non-negotiable." As Jamal stood up to leave, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Reynolds' words held more weight than he realized. The pressure to succeed, to rise through the ranks, was more intense than he had expected. But it wasn't just about the competition. There were unspoken tensions in the air, as if everyone was watching, waiting for someone to make a mistake. Later that afternoon, Jamal had his first real taste of what his new role would be like. He was assigned to a high-profile client, a businessman who had a reputation for being difficult. The ride would be long, but Jamal was ready. As he pulled up to the client's location, he tried to stay focused. This was his chance to prove himself, to show Reynolds and everyone else that he was capable. But the moment the client stepped into the car, Jamal felt the weight of the job settle in. The man was condescending, speaking in a tone that made it clear he expected to be treated like royalty. He was quick to dismiss Jamal's attempts at small talk, focusing instead on his phone and speaking in short, curt sentences. It was clear that this wasn't just any ride, it was a test. A test to see how Jamal would react. The tension in the car grew thicker as the journey continued. Jamal tried to stay calm, but the client's attitude was grating. Every word that came out of his mouth was laced with arrogance. Yet, Jamal remained composed, focusing on the road ahead. He had learned long ago that it was better to keep his cool than to engage in a battle of words. As they neared the destination, the client finally spoke, his voice dripping with disdain. You're lucky to be driving for a company like this. Most people would be thrilled to be in my position, working with someone like me. Jamal glanced in the rearview mirror, locking eyes with the client. I'm not lucky, he said quietly. I'm here because I've earned it. The words hung in the air for a moment before the client scoffed, dismissing Jamal's statement. But in that brief exchange, something had shifted. Jamal had taken control of the moment, refusing to be intimidated. He didn't know it yet, but that small act of defiance would be noticed. It was the beginning of something, a new chapter in his life where he would no longer be defined by the expectations of others. The rest of the ride was a quiet one, the tension palpable. The client didn't say another word until they reached the destination, at which point he hastily shoved the tip into Jamal's hand and slammed the door behind him. Jamal didn't count the tip, though. His mind was racing, his thoughts swirling. Had he made an impression? Had he done enough to prove that he was worthy of the opportunities Reynolds' company had promised? As Jamal drove back to the office, he couldn't help but replay the exchange in his head. The client's arrogance had been suffocating, but Jamal had stayed calm, firm in his conviction that he wasn't just another driver to be looked down upon. He had earned his place at the table, and this was only the beginning. Yet, a small voice inside him wondered if that was enough. Was a single defiant moment going to change how people viewed him in this high-stakes world? Or would it take much more? When Jamal returned to the office, he was greeted by Claire, who was quick to ask how the ride had gone. Jamal gave her a simple response, not wanting to dwell on the awkwardness of the situation. But Claire's smile faltered when she noticed the look on his face. You're not sure, are you? She asked, her tone softer now. Jamal hesitated, then nodded. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I thought I handled the situation well, but I can't shake this feeling that I'm just one mistake away from being cast aside. Claire's expression softened further. She was clearly used to the pressures that came with working for Reynolds, but her empathy seemed genuine. It's not easy, Jamal. But you're not alone in feeling like this. The people who succeed here don't just do their jobs, they adapt. They understand the rules, and they learn how to play the game. Jamal felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Playing the game. He had no intention of becoming someone he wasn't, no matter how high the stakes. He wasn't about to compromise his values for the sake of fitting in. But he also knew that survival in this world would require more than just good intentions. It would require strategy, cunning, and resilience. And Jamal was prepared to fight for it. The next few days passed in a blur. Jamal continued driving for high-profile clients, navigating through awkward moments and moments of tension. Each ride seemed to present a new challenge, a new test of his patience and self-control. But with every ride, he found himself growing more confident, more determined. The people he interacted with, whether they were wealthy clients or fellow drivers, didn't intimidate him anymore. He was no longer the man who had been refused by the white customers, he was someone different now. Someone who would not be easily dismissed. But as Jamal's confidence grew, so did the competition. Reynolds' company was full of ambitious drivers, each eager to make a name for themselves. There was no shortage of people vying for the top spots, and Jamal was beginning to feel the weight of that reality. He wasn't just competing with the client's expectations, he was competing with everyone around him. Every drive, every encounter, was a chance to prove that he belonged. But Jamal couldn't help but wonder, was this the life he had always dreamed of? Was the price of success too high? One day, while taking a break in the company's lounge, Jamal overheard a conversation between two other drivers. They were discussing the upcoming gala, a lavish event that Reynolds was hosting for his top clients. The gala was a major deal, an event that everyone wanted to be part of. Jamal listened intently, catching snippets of their conversation about how they were planning to impress Reynolds and the clients. But as they spoke, Jamal's stomach churned. It became clear that the gala wasn't just about making a good impression, it was about securing a future with Reynolds' company. This was a chance to prove to everyone that you had what it took to be part of the elite circle. The more Jamal thought about it, the more he realized that the gala could be his opportunity. He wasn't going to just attend as another driver, he was going to make sure that everyone noticed him. He didn't know exactly how yet, but he would find a way. If this event was the key to moving up in the company, Jamal would make it his mission to stand out. Days leading up to the gala were filled with tension. Jamal's mind was occupied with the idea of making the most of this opportunity. He practiced his interactions, making sure he was ready for whatever might come his way. He made sure his appearance was impeccable, that he looked the part of someone who belonged in a world of luxury and influence. He wasn't going to let his background define him anymore. He was going to show everyone that he was capable of more than just driving. He had the drive, the ambition, and the talent to prove it. The night of the gala arrived, and Jamal pulled up in the black limo. The event was everything he had imagined and more. The guests were dressed to the nines, sipping champagne and discussing business deals with casual ease. The air was filled with excitement, but Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was an outsider, someone who had somehow found his way into a world that didn't truly want him there. As he made his way through the crowd, Jamal found himself eyeing Reynolds, who was engaged in conversation with some of the company's top clients. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had to make an impression, to stand out from the crowd. But as Jamal approached, he was stopped by one of the senior drivers, who gave him a cold, scrutinizing look. "You really think you belong here, don't you?" the driver asked, his tone dripping with disdain. Jamal's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was just another test. Another challenge to prove he had what it took. He met the senior driver's gaze and responded with unwavering confidence. "I know I belong here," he said. The words hung in the air, a declaration that Jamal would not back down. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The night was just beginning, and Jamal was determined to make sure that he wasn't forgotten. But as the night wore on, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, something that went beyond the gala, beyond the competition. There was a sense that things were shifting, and Jamal was caught in the middle of it all. He didn't know what was coming next, but he could feel it in his bones. The tension was thick, and the stakes were higher than ever before. As Jamal made his way through the crowd, his mind raced with the possibilities of what might happen next. He knew the competition was fierce, but this was a new level. The air was thick with ambition, and each guest at the gala seemed to wear their success like a badge of honor. Jamal couldn't help but feel out of place, but he was determined not to let it show. Reynolds was still deep in conversation with a group of clients, laughing and shaking hands as though he were a king in his domain. Jamal could feel his pulse quicken. He had seen how Reynolds interacted with people in the office, always so polished, so calculated. But tonight, in this glittering environment, there was something else in the air. A certain intensity that Jamal couldn't quite put his finger on. It was as if everyone was waiting for something big to happen, something that would shift the dynamics of the company. Jamal approached the bar, grabbing a drink to steady his nerves. He tried to make himself as inconspicuous as possible, but it was hard when all eyes seemed to be on him. He couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversations. The clients were discussing their plans, throwing around names of business deals that made Jamal's head spin. But one conversation caught his attention. Two senior drivers were talking in hushed tones, their faces grim. "Have you heard? They're making moves again," one of them said. The other nodded. "I'm telling you, things are about to get real. We need to watch our backs." Jamal's curiosity piqued. He had been hearing whispers about changes within the company, but nothing concrete. He couldn't help but wonder what was really going on. What was about to happen? Before he could ask any more questions, Jamal was interrupted by a sudden tap on his shoulder. He turned around to see Claire, her face flushed with excitement. "There you are. I was wondering when you'd make an appearance," she said, her eyes sparkling. "Come, you have to meet someone." Jamal hesitated for a moment, but the urge to network, to make a connection that might advance his position, overpowered his doubts. He followed Claire through the crowd, weaving between groups of people until they reached a secluded corner where a man in a sharp suit was waiting. "This is Marcus," Claire introduced him. "He's one of Reynolds' top clients, and he's been asking about you." Jamal shook Marcus's hand, trying to hide the surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected someone like this to take an interest in him. Marcus was a tall man with sharp features, his well-tailored suit radiating wealth and power. His smile was warm, but there was something calculating in his eyes, something that made Jamal uneasy. "I've heard a lot about you, Jamal," Marcus said, his voice smooth. "You're making quite an impression around here." Jamal smiled politely, unsure of what to say. "I'm just doing my job." Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Well, it seems to me like you're doing much more than just your job. You've got ambition. I like that. People like you don't come around often." Jamal felt his stomach tighten. What did Marcus mean by that? Was he complimenting him, or was there something more? Before he could ask, Marcus continued. "You know," Marcus said, leaning in slightly, "Reynolds has a reputation for being tough. But he's also smart. He knows how to pick the winners. And I have a feeling you're one of them." Jamal felt a flicker of excitement, but it was quickly followed by a wave of suspicion. Was Marcus just flattering him, or was there something else going on? He couldn't tell, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to keep his guard up. "Well, I appreciate the kind words," Jamal said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just focused on proving myself." Marcus smiled, clearly satisfied with Jamal's response. "I like that. It's good to see someone who's not content to sit in the background. You keep this up, and you'll go far." As Jamal thanked him and stepped away, he couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's words were laced with more than just praise. There was something in his tone, something that felt like a challenge, like a test. But Jamal wasn't sure what it was yet. As the night continued, Jamal found himself caught in a whirlwind of conversations and interactions. It was as though he was being pulled in different directions, each person trying to make an impression, to secure their place in Reynolds's world. Jamal did his best to stay composed, but the tension was starting to feel unbearable. The more he tried to stay focused, the more he realized that the stakes were much higher than he had initially thought. And then, just as the night seemed to be winding down, a commotion broke out near the entrance. Jamal turned to see a large group of people gathered around, their attention focused on something, or rather, someone, just outside the door. The crowd parted, and Jamal's heart skipped a beat when he saw who it was. It was the client from the other night, the one who had refused Jamal's service. He was standing at the door, his face contorted in disbelief as he stared at something just beyond the crowd. Jamal's pulse quickened as he took a step closer, trying to make sense of what was happening. The client looked stunned, almost paralyzed by what he was seeing. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for an explanation. And then Jamal saw it, the source of the commotion. A sleek, black limo had pulled up outside, its engine purring quietly. The door opened, and from it emerged none other than Jamal himself. For a moment, the entire room seemed to fall silent, as if the universe itself had paused to take in the absurdity of the situation. The client's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't believe what was happening. Jamal stood there, at the center of it all, staring back at the client. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when he could finally show everyone that he wasn't just some chauffeur to be dismissed. He had made it. But what would happen next? Would the client apologize for his earlier behavior? Would the room recognize Jamal's success, or would the tension escalate even further? Jamal didn't know, but one thing was certain: the game had changed. And now, everything was on the line. The room was still, all eyes fixed on Jamal as he stood at the center of the crowd. The black limo gleamed under the soft glow of the gala lights, its sleek, polished surface reflecting the stunned expressions of the guests. Jamal's heart raced, each beat louder than the last. The client, the one who had refused him just days before, was still frozen in place, unable to tear his gaze away from the limo. Jamal could see the confusion, the realization beginning to dawn on him. The murmurs started slowly, a soft ripple that grew into a wave of hushed conversations. What's going on? Is that really him? What's he doing in a limo? The crowd buzzed with questions, but Jamal remained silent, standing tall, his posture proud yet uncertain. He had wanted to show them, to prove his worth, but now that he was in the spotlight, it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on him. Reynolds, who had been mingling with clients earlier, caught sight of the scene and made his way over, his sharp eyes quickly assessing the situation. Jamal felt the pressure mounting as his boss approached. Reynolds was known for his calculated moves, always in control, always a step ahead. Would he see this as a triumph for Jamal, or as an unnecessary risk? The client, still paralyzed by shock, took a hesitant step forward, his eyes never leaving Jamal. How did you, what is this? His voice was shaky, disbelief written all over his face. He couldn't quite grasp what was happening, why Jamal, the same driver he had so easily dismissed earlier, was now standing in front of him in a black limo, a symbol of wealth and status. Jamal took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was the moment, the test. The moment to decide whether to respond with humility or let the confrontation unfold. His mind flashed back to that evening in the parking lot, the sting of rejection still fresh. But he had grown since then. He wasn't the same man who had stood there, waiting for a chance to prove himself. Now, he had the chance to flip the script, to control the narrative. I guess I've upgraded, Jamal said, his voice calm but with an edge. Funny how things work out. The words were simple, but they held weight. The client shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words never came. Instead, his gaze flicked toward Reynolds, who had now stopped just a few feet away, watching with a keen interest. Reynolds didn't say a word, but his presence was enough to heighten the tension. Jamal could feel the subtle shift in the room, the way the air seemed to thicken. Everyone was waiting for something, an apology, an explanation, or a confrontation. But no one seemed to know how to break the silence. The client finally spoke, his voice low. I didn't know who you were. I thought, he paused, searching for the right words, but Jamal could tell that it wasn't just about the limo anymore. It was about something deeper, something unspoken. The man had made an assumption, one that had been proven wrong in the most dramatic way possible. Jamal met his gaze steadily. Yeah, I know what you thought. The words felt like a punch, but he didn't flinch. But it doesn't matter now, does it? The tension between them crackled in the air, the weight of unspoken apologies and realizations hanging between them. But just as it seemed the conversation might reach a boiling point, another voice interrupted. Is there a problem here, gentlemen? It was Marcus, the client Jamal had met earlier in the night. He had been quietly observing the exchange from a distance, but now he stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of the room. The client quickly turned toward Marcus, his posture suddenly shifting to one of respect. No problem at all, he said, though his voice betrayed his unease. Just a misunderstanding. Marcus looked between the two men, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. Jamal could feel the pressure mounting. As Marcus assessed the situation, but there was something about the way Marcus carried himself, something that made Jamal uneasy. The man had a way of reading people, of knowing exactly when to step in and when to stay back. And right now, he was watching, waiting for something to unfold. Reynolds, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the conversation, finally spoke. His voice was measured, but there was an edge to it that Jamal had come to recognize. I trust this is all sorted out, he asked, his gaze flicking between Jamal and the client. The client quickly nodded. Yes, absolutely. I was mistaken. But Jamal wasn't so sure. He could see it in the client's eyes, the discomfort, the unease. The man hadn't fully processed what had just happened. He hadn't understood the power dynamics shifting before him. As the client stammered out his apology, Jamal's mind raced. Was this really an apology, or just a way for the man to save face? Was this just a token gesture to smooth things over, or was there something more at play here? Jamal couldn't help but wonder if this was all part of a bigger game, a game he was only starting to understand. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The silence that followed felt heavy, as if everyone was waiting for the next move to be made. But Jamal didn't know what that move would be. He had been thrust into this moment, into this spotlight, but now that he was here, he wasn't sure where it would lead. And as the crowd continued to watch, Jamal felt his resolve harden. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. He wasn't going to let anyone dictate his path anymore. The game had changed, and it was time to see just how far he could go. The tension in the air was palpable as Jamal stood there, waiting for the next words to be spoken. The crowd had gathered in a tight circle around them, and though the gala was supposed to be a celebration, it had taken on the energy of a high-stakes game. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, uncertain about what would happen next. Even Marcus, who had a reputation for handling situations like these with tact, appeared to be on edge. Jamal knew that the way things played out here would define not just the rest of the night, but his future. He had already made a statement by showing up in the limo, but now he had to see if the words he would choose could drive that point home. For a moment, he considered staying quiet, letting the uncomfortable silence do the work for him. The man who had refused him earlier stood just a few feet away, his face flushed with embarrassment, unable to meet Jamal's eyes. The power had shifted, but how far would that shift go? The client's voice broke the silence, hesitant at first, as though he was still weighing his words. "Look, what I did before wasn't right. I misjudged you, and I'm sorry for that." His voice was strained, but there was an edge of sincerity in it. Jamal could tell that the man's apology wasn't coming from a place of pride, but from the realization that his actions had consequences. However, Jamal didn't feel the weight of the apology settle inside him. It felt hollow, as if it was more about saving face than making amends. Before Jamal could respond, Reynolds took a step forward, his cold, calculated demeanor cutting through the tension like a knife. "This isn't the time for half-baked apologies," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "What matters now is what happens next. What kind of man are you going to be from here on out?" Jamal's gaze snapped to Reynolds, surprised by his intervention. He had expected Reynolds to let the situation play out more naturally, but the power dynamics had shifted. Reynolds wasn't just observing, he was making his own move. The client shifted uneasily, glancing at Marcus, then back at Jamal. He seemed torn, caught between wanting to salvage his dignity and trying to figure out what had gone wrong. I didn't know," the man mumbled. "I didn't realize who you were." He glanced at the limo again, his eyes momentarily widening with the dawning realization. But what he didn't know was that it wasn't about the limo anymore. Jamal wasn't standing here to prove anything about the car. This wasn't about the surface, it was about the way people treated each other, the assumptions they made, and the way that Jamal had been written off. Jamal had already learned the hard way that people made assumptions based on appearances, based on their preconceived ideas of who someone should be. What the client didn't realize was that Jamal was more than just his job, more than just the uniform he wore or the way he was perceived. He had earned his place in this world, and tonight, he was determined to make that clear. "I don't need your apology," Jamal said, his voice steady and calm. The words hung in the air like a challenge. "I'm not here to make you feel better about yourself. I'm here to make sure that the next time you think you know someone, you don't just look at them and judge them based on what's in front of you. That's not how the world works. You should have known that." The client's face darkened, the words stinging more than he had anticipated. For a moment, it looked like he might say something more, but instead, he fell silent, his pride taking a hit. Jamal could feel his own heartbeat pounding in his chest, his mind racing. He hadn't expected the conversation to unfold this way. The truth was, he didn't know how to fix what had been broken, how to get back to a place where things felt even or right. He only knew that this moment, this uncomfortable, raw moment, was the turning point. He had to stand his ground. He had to let them know that he wasn't someone to be dismissed. The crowd remained quiet, watching the exchange with bated breath. Jamal felt the weight of their eyes on him, but he refused to let that pressure break him. It wasn't about impressing anyone anymore. It was about respect. About dignity. As the seconds ticked by, Jamal began to wonder if anyone would dare to speak up again, if anyone would address what had just happened. But before anyone could find the words, Marcus's voice broke the silence, a smooth and controlled interruption. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, stepping forward with an air of authority. "I think we've all learned a valuable lesson tonight." His eyes swept over the crowd before locking with Jamal's, an unreadable expression on his face. "What matters now is how we all choose to move forward from this point. We can stand here, dwelling in discomfort, or we can walk away knowing that we've come out of this a little wiser." Jamal noticed the subtle glance Marcus threw toward the client, a look that suggested something deeper was at play. There was more going on here than just the surface-level apology and confrontation. Marcus was known for his ability to move pieces on the board without people realizing it, and Jamal wondered if he was orchestrating something he couldn't quite see yet. Reynolds, ever the observer, nodded subtly, as if agreeing with Marcus's sentiment, though his gaze remained fixed on Jamal. Jamal wasn't sure what Reynolds' angle was, but the older man's sharp eyes hadn't missed anything. The tension in the air seemed to stretch, but Jamal held firm, unwilling to back down. The crowd around them was still watching, some whispering, others simply observing. Jamal could hear snippets of conversation, a mix of surprise, disbelief, and curiosity. It wasn't just a battle of egos anymore, it had become something much bigger. The night was far from over, but Jamal knew one thing for certain: he had set a new course for himself. Whether or not the client acknowledged his actions, whether or not Reynolds approved, didn't matter. What mattered was that Jamal had made his presence known. He had taken control of his narrative. But the story wasn't over. There were still pieces to be moved, decisions yet to be made, and the evening was about to take another unexpected turn. The room felt charged with a quiet intensity, and Jamal stood at the center of it all, surrounded by murmurs and sidelong glances. The moment had not yet passed, but Jamal could sense that it would define the rest of the evening. He could feel the weight of eyes on him from every direction, some in judgment, others in admiration, but all of them watching, waiting for what would happen next. The client, still standing across from Jamal, seemed to shrink under the pressure, his earlier bravado dissipating. He had come to this event thinking he was in control, but now the scales had shifted. There was no way he could undo the damage, and the apology he had offered felt insignificant in comparison to the hurt his actions had caused. But was he truly sorry? Or had Jamal just exposed him as someone who only regretted being caught? Jamal didn't want to get caught up in figuring out the client's motivations. What mattered to him was what would happen next, not just for himself, but for the people like him, those who had been underestimated, judged, and overlooked their whole lives. He couldn't let this moment pass without standing firm. This wasn't just about personal redemption, it was about showing everyone in this room that things could and should be different. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence, broken only by the faint clink of glass as a server walked by with drinks. Marcus had been quiet for too long, but Jamal could tell that the older man was sizing up the situation, trying to decide what to do next. Reynolds, who had made his presence known earlier, was still hanging in the background, his eyes trained on the client. Jamal wasn't sure if Reynolds was silently rooting for him or just waiting to see how it played out, but he didn't care. This was his moment, and he was determined to own it. The client cleared his throat, still visibly uncomfortable. I didn't mean to make you feel like you weren't worth my time. That's not what I intended, he muttered, his voice a little quieter now, more tentative. But the words seemed hollow, as if they were just filling the space between them rather than offering any real understanding. Jamal didn't know if the apology was sincere or if it was just a reaction to the uncomfortable situation he found himself in. What he did know was that it didn't change the way he had been treated before, the assumption that because of his job, his appearance, or whatever else, he wasn't worthy of the same respect as anyone else. He had been dismissed, underestimated, and now, standing in front of the client, Jamal realized that nothing could truly erase the sting of those moments. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could make sure no one else would have to face the same thing. I appreciate the words, Jamal said slowly, his voice calm but firm. But it's not about the words, is it? It's about how we see each other, how we treat each other. You don't get to just go back and erase what happened. That's not how it works. You had your chance to treat me like a person, and you chose not to. The client shifted uncomfortably, his hands nervously adjusting his tie, but Jamal held his ground. He wasn't going to back down, not now. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Jamal could feel the heat of it in his chest. It wasn't just the client's apology, it was everything that had led to this moment, everything that had brought him to the point of not being afraid to speak his truth. For so long, Jamal had swallowed his pride, held his tongue, and smiled politely through the discomfort. But tonight, that was all going to change. Just as Jamal thought the silence would stretch on indefinitely, Marcus stepped forward, breaking the standoff. "I think what we've all learned tonight," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "is that judgment is easy. It's the easiest thing in the world to look at someone and decide their worth before knowing them. But true understanding takes time, and it takes effort. We all make mistakes, sometimes big ones, but it's how we choose to make amends that counts." Jamal turned to face Marcus, meeting his eyes. It wasn't clear if Marcus was speaking directly to him or the room as a whole, but it didn't matter. He had a point. People made mistakes, and people grew. But it wasn't enough just to apologize. It was about how one moved forward, how they learned from their mistakes. And in this moment, Jamal was determined to show that he wasn't the same man he had been when he first walked into this room. The client seemed to be thinking deeply about Marcus's words, and Jamal could see the wheels turning in his mind. Would he actually take this opportunity to change? Or would this moment pass, and he would go back to the same old way of thinking, pretending the discomfort wasn't there? Jamal didn't know, and truthfully, he didn't care. What mattered now was that he had shown the world, this world, at least, that he wouldn't be ignored. He wouldn't be dismissed. He had proved that he was worth more than what others saw on the surface, and in that moment, that was enough. But as the night wore on, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something was still brewing beneath the surface. The conversation was far from over, and even though the client had apologized and Marcus had delivered his speech, Jamal sensed that there was more to this situation than met the eye. Reynolds, ever the silent observer, had yet to speak. There were pieces to this puzzle that still hadn't been revealed. As the crowd began to shift, and the murmurs of conversation grew louder, Jamal took a deep breath. This wasn't the end of the story. It couldn't be. Something told him that the real challenge was just beginning. As Jamal stood there, feeling the weight of his decision to confront the client, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease settling in his chest. He had said what needed to be said, but something still felt off. There was a tension lingering in the air that he couldn't quite shake. He glanced around the room, watching as the crowd started to disperse, murmuring about the unexpected turn of events. But then, something caught his eye, something he hadn't noticed before. Reynolds, who had been observing silently throughout the entire exchange, was now moving toward the door with purpose. His stride was brisk, his expression unreadable. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. What was he up to? Reynolds had always been a man of few words, but there was something about his demeanor that felt different now, almost as if he were hiding something. Jamal wasn't sure why, but a chill ran down his spine as he followed Reynolds with his eyes, trying to make sense of the situation. Just as Reynolds reached the door, he paused and turned back toward the room. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to leave without a word, but then he spoke, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Jamal," he called, his tone sharp and deliberate. "You really think you've won this one?" The words hung in the air, and for a split second, Jamal felt a flash of confusion. Had he heard that right? What did Reynolds mean by won this one? Before Jamal could process what was happening, Reynolds pushed open the door and stepped outside, leaving the room in stunned silence. Jamal felt his pulse quicken, his mind racing. Something about the way Reynolds had spoken sent a jolt of realization through him. Had he just been played? Jamal's eyes scanned the room, searching for answers. The client, who had been so eager to apologize just moments ago, now stood with a smug smile on his face. Jamal's stomach sank. Was this some sort of setup? Was this all part of a bigger game? He turned back toward the door, still processing Reynolds' cryptic words. Something wasn't adding up. Reynolds had always been quiet, but never this calculating. What had he meant by that question? Had he known something Jamal didn't? Without thinking, Jamal pushed through the crowd, his mind whirling with possibilities. He needed to find Reynolds and figure out what was going on. He needed answers. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, the world around him seemed to grow still, almost as if it were holding its breath. Reynolds was nowhere in sight, but Jamal wasn't about to let this go. He wasn't going to let the last few hours of his life be reduced to some kind of trap. As he walked toward the parking lot, the faint glow of streetlights illuminating his path, a sense of dread washed over him. Every instinct told him that he was walking into something much bigger than he realized. The words Reynolds had spoken echoed in his mind, haunting him. "You really think you've won this one?" The question reverberated in his thoughts as he quickened his pace. Had he won? Or had he been set up for something far worse? Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with the worst possible scenarios. As he reached the edge of the parking lot, he stopped in his tracks. A sleek, black limousine sat idling at the far end, its windows tinted dark, obscuring the view of whoever, or whatever, was inside. Jamal's pulse quickened. This wasn't just coincidence. He had to know what was going on. But before he could take another step, the door to the limo opened, and a figure stepped out. It was Reynolds. But this wasn't the same man Jamal had known. Reynolds was dressed sharply, his usual reserved demeanor replaced with a confident, almost arrogant air. The change was so dramatic that Jamal could hardly recognize him. The sight sent a shockwave through Jamal's body, and every instinct screamed that he was missing something crucial. Reynolds looked directly at Jamal, his eyes cold and calculating. "Surprised?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I figured you'd eventually put it together. It was just a matter of time." Jamal's mind raced. What the hell was going on? Reynolds stepped closer, his smile widening. "You really thought you were the one in control tonight, huh? That you'd walk in here and make your point, and everyone would just accept it? You're so much more naive than I gave you credit for." Jamal's breath hitched. The pieces were starting to come together, but the bigger picture was still blurry. Was Reynolds working with the client all along? Had Jamal been manipulated from the very start? His mind spun with questions, and the tension in the air was palpable. "Why?" Jamal managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why all of this?" Reynolds chuckled darkly. "You were just a pawn, Jamal. All of this was never about you. It was about sending a message. About control. About power. You were the perfect target, and now, well, now we get to see what happens next." Before Jamal could respond, Reynolds turned and walked back toward the limo, leaving Jamal standing there, his mind reeling. What had he gotten himself into? What was the real game behind all of this? As the limo's door slammed shut, the vehicle roared to life and sped off into the night, leaving Jamal in the dust. He was left alone with more questions than ever before, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He had thought he was in control. He had thought he'd turned the tables, but now, with the truth beginning to surface, he realized that the game had just begun. And he had no idea what the next move would be. Jamal stood there in the parking lot, the engine's roar of the departing limo still echoing in his ears. The cold night air wrapped around him, but it did nothing to chill the heat of confusion and anger building inside him. He couldn't fathom what had just happened. The entire evening, the whole confrontation, had turned into a tangled mess, and now he was left with more questions than answers. What did Reynolds mean by sending a message? And why had Jamal been the one chosen to play such a central role? The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, impossible to fit together. He had assumed he was in control, that the apology from the client had been his victory. But now it felt like that was just the beginning of something far darker. Jamal's mind was racing, and he knew he had to figure out what was going on before it was too late. He had been pushed into this situation, whether he liked it or not, and now he was too deep to back out. He glanced around the parking lot, hoping for some sign of clarity, but the place seemed eerily quiet. There were no more cars pulling in or out, no more voices from the building. Only the distant hum of the city's nightlife could be heard, and that only seemed to amplify his sense of isolation. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out quickly, hoping for some kind of relief, but instead, it was a message from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before opening it, the sudden dread rising in his chest. "You think you've figured it out, Jamal? You're in deeper than you realize. We'll be watching." His heart skipped a beat. The words were chilling, and the implications were far worse than he could have imagined. Who's watching? And why? Jamal's thoughts spun, but one thing was clear, He couldn't do this alone. He needed help. He needed someone who could see things from a different perspective, someone who might have the answers to the questions that had been gnawing at him for hours. His first instinct was to reach out to his closest friend, Malik. Malik had always been the more level-headed of the two, and Jamal knew he could trust him. He quickly typed out a message. Malik, I need you. Something's not right. Meet me at the old diner by 10. I'll explain everything. He hit send and then immediately regretted it. The sense of urgency that had pushed him to reach out now felt reckless. What if this was all a trap? What if, by getting too close, he was walking straight into more danger? But the thought of being alone in this, of not. Marcus' smile faded, and he stepped forward, his voice calm and collected. Jamal, I didn't want it to come to this. But I had no choice. You never understood, did you? The way the world works, the way people like us are treated. I had to teach you, to show you that things aren't as simple as you thought. Jamal shook his head, his heart pounding. You've been behind all of this? The limo, the messages, the manipulation? You've been using me this entire time? Marcus nodded, his expression softening slightly. I didn't want to hurt you. But you had to see it. You had to feel it for yourself. Every single time you've been rejected, ignored, underestimated, it's all part of the game. And now you're finally beginning to understand. The words hung in the air, and Jamal felt as if the ground beneath him was crumbling. His brother, the one person he thought he could trust, had been the mastermind behind everything. The limo, the clients, the manipulations, it was all part of a larger plan to open Jamal's eyes to the realities of the world they lived in. But then, as if to add a final twist, Marcus' face shifted. His eyes glinted with something darker, something that Jamal hadn't noticed before. But you're not done yet, Jamal. You're just starting to understand what this world truly is. You can't just walk away from this. Not now. There's more for you to learn. Jamal's stomach churned. He took a step back, the weight of his brother's words sinking in. What had he just become a part of? He was torn between rage, disbelief, and a sense of betrayal that went deeper than anything he'd ever felt before. And then, in that moment, everything changed again. The door slammed open, and a group of figures, shadows more than people, poured into the room. Each of them wearing dark suits, their faces obscured, and their presence suffocating. Jamal's heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. He wasn't just caught in the middle of a personal betrayal, he had become part of something much bigger. The figures moved closer, and Jamal's mind raced. His brother wasn't just teaching him a lesson, he had been grooming him for something far more sinister. And now, there was no turning back. The final twist hit like a punch to the gut. Jamal had never been the one being played, he had been the pawn all along. As the room closed in around him, Jamal had only one thought left, he had been blind to the truth for too long. And now, the real game was just beginning. Jamal's pulse raced, his mind scrambling to make sense of the chaos that surrounded him. The dark figures closing in on him seemed to be closing in on more than just his physical space. They were encroaching on the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about his brother and his place in this world. The realization that Marcus had been playing him, orchestrating everything to teach him a twisted lesson, hit him like a wrecking ball. But as the figures moved closer, a strange sense of clarity washed over him. He wasn't just here to be a pawn anymore. He wasn't going to sit idly by and let his brother drag him into this web of manipulation. Something inside him shifted, a surge of anger and determination flooding his veins. No longer would he be passive. He would take control. The tall figure closest to him stepped forward, their face still hidden by the shadows. A voice, low and cold, filled the room. Jamal, it's time for you to accept the truth. You're not who you think you are. We've been watching you for a long time. Jamal clenched his fists, his eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? Who are you? The figure's lips curled into a sinister smile, but before they could respond, Marcus intervened. Jamal, listen to me, he said, his voice urgent now, as if he suddenly realized how far this had all gone. You don't understand. It was never supposed to go this far. Jamal turned his eyes to his brother, disbelief still written across his face. You brought them here, didn't you? You're part of this, whatever it is. You let this happen. Marcus seemed to falter for just a moment, his hands trembling. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. And then, the unexpected happened. Without warning, one of the dark figures lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the collar and pulling him backward. The figure's strength was unnerving, as if they were used to overpowering people. Jamal's eyes widened as Marcus struggled, gasping for breath. Don't! Marcus tried to speak, but the figure's grip only tightened. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. What was happening? Was Marcus in danger now? Had he been betrayed by the very people he had trusted to show him the truth? Then, as the figure holding Marcus stepped back into the shadows, another voice broke the tense silence. This voice was familiar, but it wasn't Marcus's. It was softer, almost reassuring. Jamal, stop. Please. Jamal's gaze darted to the source of the voice. The figure stepped forward into the dim light, revealing themselves to be none other than his mother. Her face, lined with worry and years of untold secrets, looked at him with sorrowful eyes. For a moment, Jamal stood frozen, unable to process the sight before him. His mother? How could she be involved in all of this? He began, his voice shaking. What is going on here? What do you want from me? His mother's eyes flickered toward Marcus, who was still held by the shadowy figure. She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. Jamal, it's not what you think. We've been trying to protect you. All this time, we've been watching and waiting for the right moment. Jamal took a step back, his mind reeling. Protect me? From what? From the truth? She shook her head, her eyes filled with regret. No. From them. From everything you're about to become involved in. Suddenly, it all began to make sense. The limo, the mysterious messages, the dark figures, it wasn't just some twisted game. It wasn't just about teaching Jamal some harsh lesson. There were far bigger forces at play here, forces that had been pulling the strings behind the scenes for far too long. His mother and Marcus had been caught in a web of their own, struggling to keep Jamal out of a dark world he had no idea existed. Mom, Jamal whispered, his voice cracking, what is all of this? Why didn't you tell me? She looked down, her hands trembling as she took a deep breath. Because we were trying to protect you. But it's too late now. They know everything about you, Jamal. Everything. Jamal's stomach twisted with dread. He felt like he was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. But he refused to let fear take over. There had to be a way out. With a burst of strength, Jamal turned to the dark figures. You want me? He shouted, his voice shaking but resolute. Then take me. But leave my family out of this. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the soft rustling of the figure's clothing. For a long moment, there was no response. Jamal's heart hammered in his chest as he watched the dark figures circle him, their presence suffocating. Finally, the lead figure stepped forward, removing their hood to reveal their face. Jamal's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the person standing before him. It was Reynolds, the limo driver. The man who had seemed so distant, so professional, had been part of this all along. You, Jamal breathed, his eyes wide with shock. You've been behind this? Reynolds' lips curled into a smile. It's not about you, Jamal. It never was. It's about the bigger picture. Jamal's mind spun. The bigger picture? What was Reynolds talking about? His thoughts raced, trying to piece together the final fragments of this twisted puzzle. You think this is about some petty revenge? Reynolds continued, his voice low and cold. No, Jamal. It's about shaping the future. It's about taking control of something much larger than you can comprehend. Jamal's stomach turned as he realized the truth was even more terrifying than he could have imagined. This wasn't just about his brother, or even the limo company. This was something far more sinister, a game of power, manipulation, and control that reached far beyond the walls of this room. His mother stepped forward, her face pale. "Jamal, you don't understand. We never wanted you to be part of this world. But now you're here, and it's too late to back out." The air in the room felt heavier, the weight of all the unspoken words and hidden truths pressing down on Jamal. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was part of something much darker, much more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And now, the only thing that mattered was surviving long enough to figure out how to escape it. As Reynolds stepped closer, his hand reaching out to Jamal, a final thought echoed in Jamal's mind: there's no going back now. Jamal's heart pounded as Reynolds' hand moved closer, his shadow stretching across the floor like a suffocating veil. Every instinct in Jamal screamed at him to move, to run, but his legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. The weight of the room, the dark figures, his brother, his mother, all of it bore down on him, making it harder to breathe. But just as Reynolds' hand was about to make contact, there was a sudden shift in the air. A loud crash echoed from the hallway outside, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Jamal's eyes shot toward the door, his mind racing. Who could it be? Was it help? Or was it more danger? Before anyone could react, the door slammed open with such force that the hinges groaned. A figure, tall and muscular, burst into the room, knocking several of the dark figures aside. Jamal's eyes widened as he recognized the newcomer. It was Officer Daniels, the cop who had been following the strange occurrences around the city for weeks. Daniels had never been a part of this web, but Jamal had always felt that the officer was someone who could be trusted. "Step away from him," Officer Daniels shouted, his voice filled with authority. His hand was already reaching for his weapon, and the dark figures hesitated, clearly recognizing the presence of law enforcement. Reynolds' face twisted with frustration, but he didn't make a move, his eyes calculating. Jamal's mother looked at Officer Daniels with a mix of relief and sorrow, but there was a deeper emotion in her eyes. She knew that whatever this was, whatever had been brewing in the shadows, it wasn't going to end with a simple rescue. There would be consequences. They all knew that. "Jamal, we need to leave now," Officer Daniels urged, his eyes sharp and serious. "This is bigger than we realized, and there's no time to waste. We need to get out of here before more of them show up." Jamal nodded, his mind still spinning from the recent events. Everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. His family, the limo ride, the mysterious figures, it was as though his life had been torn apart, layer by layer, revealing a deeper conspiracy that no one had ever warned him about. "I don't know what's going on, but I can't just walk away from this, can I?" Jamal's voice trembled as he spoke, looking at his mother for answers. "You've been hiding something from me. For years. I need to know the truth." His mother's eyes filled with unshed tears. "I wish I could have protected you from it, Jamal. I really do. But I couldn't. We never wanted you to get involved in this dangerous world. Marcus and we've been trying to keep you away from it, but we couldn't." And now, her voice faltered. "It's too late." Officer Daniels stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Your mother's right. There's no simple way out of this. But right now, the most important thing is your safety. The longer you stay here, the more danger you're in." Jamal took a deep breath, looking at the figures in the room. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, their expectations, their control. It was overwhelming, but there was a spark in his chest, something inside him, something that refused to be intimidated any longer. "Why don't you tell me what you really want?" Jamal said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Why all the secrecy? Why now?" Reynolds, his lips curling into a thin, menacing smile, finally spoke up. "You're just a pawn in this game, Jamal. Just like your mother and Marcus. The difference is, you were never meant to know. But now that you do, well, things are going to get complicated." Jamal's eyes narrowed. "Complicated? I don't care about your games anymore. I just want out. No more lies, no more secrets." The tension in the room was palpable as Officer Daniels shifted his stance, positioning himself between Jamal and the dark figures. It was clear they weren't going to give up easily, but the officer was determined to protect Jamal at all costs. "Leave him alone, Reynolds," Officer Daniels commanded, his voice steady and commanding. "This ends now. You don't control him anymore." For a moment, it seemed like the entire room held its breath. The dark figures remained frozen, watching as if they were waiting for some sign, some signal that would indicate their next move. Reynolds's smile faltered for a split second, his eyes flicking to his companions. The power dynamic had shifted, and it was clear that they weren't prepared for this confrontation. Then, without warning, the door crashed open again. This time, it wasn't just one person who entered. Several more figures stepped inside, their faces cloaked in shadows. They were all wearing dark clothing, their movements synchronized and deliberate. But instead of the immediate threat Jamal had feared, they stood behind Officer Daniels, joining forces to ensure his safety. The tables had turned. "You can't stop this," Reynolds sneered, but his voice now carried a tinge of uncertainty. "This is bigger than any of you." Jamal clenched his fists, his mind racing. The truth was finally starting to come together, and it was terrifying. But the most terrifying part was knowing that the story didn't end here. He was no longer just a bystander in this strange world he had stumbled into. He was part of something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. As Officer Daniels moved forward, leading Jamal and his mother toward the exit, Jamal took one last look at the room. The dark figures were no longer a looming threat, they were just a puzzle piece in a much larger game. And Jamal realized that the game was far from over. As they made their way to safety, Jamal's mind continued to churn with questions. What had Reynolds meant by the bigger picture? What were the consequences of uncovering this truth? And what did it mean for his future? For now, he didn't have all the answers. But one thing was clear, he would never be the same again. Whatever came next, Jamal knew he was no longer just a passenger in his own life. He was ready to fight for his own freedom, for his own truth. And whatever shadows still lingered in the distance, Jamal was prepared to face them head-on. Jamal, his mother, and Officer Daniels stepped out into the cold night air, the tension in the room still lingering as they walked away. The city, once so familiar and comforting, now felt like a distant memory. Jamal's mind was in overdrive, his thoughts racing faster than he could process. The gravity of everything that had happened still hadn't fully sunk in. He could feel his pulse quicken with every step, the weight of unanswered questions pulling him down. Officer Daniels broke the silence first, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "We'll make sure you're safe. This isn't over yet, but it's a start. We need to find out who's behind all of this, and I have a feeling that it's much larger than what we're seeing now." Jamal nodded, his lips tight. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this. I never asked for any of it." "You don't have to be ready," Officer Daniels said, glancing back at the darkened building they had just left behind. "No one ever does. But you're stronger than you think. Your family's been in this for a long time, but now it's your turn to make a choice. You can either stay in the shadows or step into the light." The weight of the officer's words hit Jamal hard. His life had been shattered, and he had been thrust into a world of lies, power, and danger. But Officer Daniels was right. There was no going back now. The truth had been uncovered, and it was his responsibility to face it head-on, no matter how difficult or terrifying it might be. His mother, who had remained quiet for the entire walk, finally spoke up, her voice softer now. "I'm sorry, Jamal. For everything. I never wanted you to be involved in this. But there's something you need to know." Jamal turned to her, his heart aching with the weight of the years of secrets she had kept from him. "What is it, Mom?" She looked at him with sorrowful eyes, her hands trembling slightly. "There's more to your father's story than I ever told you. He was part of something bigger, something dangerous. I didn't want you to be dragged into it, so I kept it all from you. But you deserve to know the truth." Jamal took a deep breath, the reality of her words sinking in. His father had been part of this web, part of the mystery he had stumbled into. It felt like a betrayal, but at the same time, it was the missing piece to the puzzle that had been his life. He wanted to be angry, to shout and demand answers, but instead, he just felt empty. His father was gone, and all that was left was the aftermath of a secret he hadn't even known existed. Officer Daniels spoke up again, his voice firm. "I know this is a lot to take in, Jamal. But now that you know, it's important that you stay focused. You can't let the past control you. It's time to figure out what's next. And we'll be here every step of the way." Jamal nodded, taking a moment to steady himself. The night air felt colder now, but in that moment, he realized something. The shadows that had haunted him for so long weren't just something to fear, they were something he could fight against. He wasn't a passive observer anymore. He was part of this story now, and he had a role to play. As they reached the car parked on the street, Jamal looked up at the stars above. The night was still, the city lights flickering in the distance like tiny beacons of hope. It was a symbol of what lay ahead, uncertainty, danger, but also possibility. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. His mother, who had been silent for a while, placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know you're angry, Jamal. I know you feel betrayed. But you're not alone in this. I'm here, and we'll figure it out together. You don't have to do this alone." Jamal looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. For the first time, he realized how much she had sacrificed to keep him safe. Despite the years of secrets, she had always tried to protect him, even when it meant carrying the weight of the truth alone. "I know, Mom," Jamal replied softly. "I'm not alone. I never was." As the officer started the car, Jamal's mind shifted from the chaos of the past to the uncertainty of the future. He knew there were still answers to find, people to confront, and a world to uncover. But the darkness that had once seemed so overwhelming now felt a little less frightening. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance anymore. He had the power to choose his path. And that was the most important realization of all. As they drove off into the night, the city fading into the background, Jamal glanced at the rearview mirror. The shadows that had once seemed to follow him were now behind him. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he was in control of his own destiny. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. But this chapter had come to a close. And Jamal was ready for whatever came next.